Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and I've broke my old headphone and mic set out of mothballs because there's a massive rainstorm outside and my microphone was picking that up, so forgive me if you hear a bit of that in the background. But today we're going to be talking about flashbacks. Now, flashbacks are a great tool in any GM's arsenal, but before we really jump into that, first of all, let's cover what are flashbacks. Now, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the technique from various TV shows and movies, but in case you aren't, a flashback is essentially a cutaway scene where you move away from events in the present of your campaign and you look at something that occurred in the past. So, why are flashbacks useful in RPGs? Well, if you're looking to make a consistent role-playing world or campaign where events do not just spring into being whole cloth, for instance, an NPC doesn't wake up one morning and go, "Oh, I fancy being an evil villain today." Events are normally the result of a series of other events that lead to an outcome. If you look, for example, at the romantic tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, the eventual deaths of the two lovers are a result of the sequence of events leading from the feud between the Montague and Capulet families, the two youngsters falling in love, Juliet's family's plans to marry her to Paris, Romeo not being informed about Juliet's plans to fake her own death, and numerous other events. Were the sequence of events different, then the outcome would not have been the same. There is a logical sequence from cause to effect, although sometimes the logical bit does get stretched quite far in fiction and roleplay, but nevertheless it's still there. Often the history of a campaign world in a role-playing game, i.e. the time before your game started, seems quite distant and can be a little dry or remote compared to the exciting action that's taking place in the present of your campaign world. If you want to get the players interested in the history of your campaign world and having some idea of why things are the way they are in the present, which, let's face it, presumably you do, otherwise, let's be honest, we probably wouldn't spend so much time detailing it. There's no better way to do this than to have them actually play out some part of that history and experience it firsthand. However, this does present some challenges to the aspiring flashback using GM, which I'll discuss now. Now, one of the challenges with using flashbacks to explore the history of your campaign world is that some of your world's history is set in stone and cannot be changed. Now, if, as with most worlds, you do have these events that need to have occurred for your campaign world to have reached the points it's at, a far better way to present this, in my opinion, to the players is to actually still have the PCs play through the flashback, but as minor players who are the supporting cast of the historical event. Now, no one normally likes to play in a campaign where everything is predetermined, so even if the main course of events is set, allow your PCs to affect other things that have maybe not been as concretely nailed down by your campaign background. This has two effects. One, the players can actually have an impact on the background of the campaign world and will feel like they're actually making a difference by playing through the flashback, and it gets them more involved. Two, it also, for you as a GM, handily fills in some of the blanks in your campaign world, creating a more textured and nuanced world. But it won't seem like just more dry and dusty details that have no real impact on the PCs. Players will be more interested in it since they help to create and shape the details of the history. For example, if I've created a campaign world where King Robert III sought to rid his land of an undead curse, he passed a series of challenges to prove himself to his deities, prayed in the wilderness for 2 days, and was then gifted with a magical sword that he used to defeat the necromancer responsible for the curse. Then there are a few things that we've already probably nailed down. The rough character of King Robert, the effects of the undead curse on the kingdom, what the challenges were he undertook, the events leading up to the necromancer's defeat, and the appearance and rough powers of the magic sword, and perhaps even its eventual fate, whether it was kept as a royal heirloom or lost in the confrontation with the necromancer. However, there are a number of details and elements in even this very simplified example that are open for interpretation. For instance, the personalities of the people recorded in histories tend to be very generic. You can reveal a more three-dimensional version of a historic figure. 2. Perhaps there were more challenges than were known about. 3. Did King Robert actually complete all the challenges on his own, or did he have help? 4. Although the overall results of historical battles are known, the details are generally only gained from secondary source materials, books, etc., and may present a biased or incomplete view. This gives you plenty of room to play with commonly held misconceptions. And 5. The origins of the magic sword. Perhaps it was crafted by the servants of the deity elsewhere, and your flashback could be playing through the adventures of the crafters, procuring the necessary materials. Having the players play through background elements like this, which are largely unknown to the average everyday person in your campaign world, gives them a feeling that they're peeking behind the curtain of your campaign world history and seeing what really went on, even if their normal characters may not be entirely aware of it. Of course, if you're prepared for your players to change the history of your campaign world, then you'll have a lot more leeway with regards to your flashback sequence. After all, as Winston Churchill said, history is written by the victors, who is to say that the commonly held view of history in your campaign world is 100% the actual accurate truth of what happened. It's often a problem for law enforcement in real life that witness statements can be inherently unreliable. Two different people watching the same crime occurring can give varying descriptions of the people who were responsible. The human memory and perceptions are not infallible. If two people watching an event occurring in front of them can't give an accurate description of it a few scant hours later, then how much more so is this effect going to be exaggerated with events that took place hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, and we only have dusty manuscripts and tattered books, if we're lucky, to tell us what occurred. Written accounts of history can also have their own biases, as I said earlier. For example, if the history of the kingdom was written by scribes sponsored by King Robert's royal dynasty, then they may have attempted to further villainise their opposing numbers, to actively curry favour with their rich patrons. Perhaps when you have your player characters actually play through the flashback, they discover that the Necromancer's empire was actually just a kingdom with different funerary beliefs, and that King Robert used a perfectly natural illness occurring in his own empire as an excuse to annex them and seize valuable resources. Now, obviously, you can't have your players completely rewrite the campaign history of your world, nor should you, without some sort of time-travelling hijinks involved, but that's beyond the scope of this video, and I'll probably cover it in a future video. But even within the framework of established events, there is considerable leeway for players having an impact on the details of the setting. Of course, flashbacks do not have to be just used to show the far distant history of your campaign setting. You can also use this within the timeline of your current campaign to fill in some extra details. For instance, perhaps your players travelled over a mountain pass, taking a week of game time, but since it wasn't important, you just skimmed over it. However, later on, you could flash back to that journey and fill in some details. Just to give you a random example, perhaps the players come across the bones of a giant mountain wolf in the course of their adventures, and a player character makes a successful knowledge check. Rather than give them a simple description, you could flash back to an encounter with such a wolf during their mountain travels, highlighting some of the abilities and behaviour of the creature that the player character noticed during that encounter. Now, this was a technique I used in a recent Jadepunk session. We had a period of time that passed between two sessions that wasn't really covered in a great deal of detail, whilst two of the player characters, Yoshida and Batu, were out looking for their friend Yuto, who was under the influence of a memory-affecting substance. Later on, Matthew, or Rhaego the Dragonborn as he's known on YouTube, who plays Yoshida, earned an advance in the system, which is sort of like the Fate equivalent of XP or experience points, and wanted to acquire a red jade tattoo that was capable of redirecting and focusing energies, effectively absorbing the energy of explosions and such like into himself, but sparing others the effect. Now, neither of us wanted it to just magically appear in the setting, so we decided to have a brief flashback at the start of the next session, where during that time period when they'd been looking for Yuto, Yoshida visited a tattoo parlour and had his red jade tattoo inscribed. The flashback was also used to introduce a location and a couple of NPCs sympathetic to the rebellious Jiang Hu, the organisation that the PCs belonged to, who had not been featured before but now have a little bit of history with at least one of the player characters. Okay, so here's my advice for running flashbacks. Decide what level of change within your campaign world history you are comfortable with. 2. If the players are not going to be using their own characters, have some pre-gens created and give them a choice of which one they want to play in the flashback. This saves you a lot of time and means that the actors on the historical stage are already set and their abilities are more predictable. 3. Go into a flashback scene with a clear goal in mind, and once this goal is achieved, end the flashback. 4. If there is a way for the PCs to find out what occurred in the flashback, assuming they weren't involved directly, then have them do so, since the only way for the past to impact the present of your campaign is if someone knows about it. I mean, perhaps the PCs find a book detailing the truth of the situation, but when they read it, instead of giving them a lengthy monologue describing the events that occurred, have them actually play through it in flashback form. And 5. If it's possible to do so, I find running flashbacks as an entirely separate session can be useful because it helps the players and yourself keep the events of the flashback and the normal course of the campaign world a little separate from each other. It just puts that little bit of distance in. So there we are. Flashbacks can be great tools for filling in some details of your campaign history and letting your players, although not necessarily their normal characters, experience it in a more dramatic and interesting way. They are also a good way to add details to previous dead time in campaigns and introduce NPCs connected with the player characters, although I suggest not doing this too often or it'll start to seem a little contrived. Flashbacks can also be used to have sessions featuring favourite PCs or NPCs that may have died or ceased to play an active part in the campaign for one reason or another. For example, perhaps you run a flashback featuring a long dead and much beloved PC giving some advice to one of the current player characters when they were younger. This is a great way of saying to the players that nothing's ever really lost in RPGs and that the best stories never really die. So I hope if you've enjoyed this video you'll consider clicking on like and subscribe by clicking on the red dice up in the corner there. If you have any comments on flashbacks or how to use them in your game or ways that you've used them in your game, please hit me up in the comments box down below, or as usual talk to me on Google+. I really do enjoy reading your comments. Until I see you next time, thank you very much for watching. Happy gaming.